welcome everybody. Thank you for coming. Today we're honored to have Lucian Lee calling in from a very different time zone. Lucian is the Senior Advisor for Systemic Cost Analysis at the International Rescue Committee, where he coordinates a consortium of non-governmental organizations to use cost analysis for learning and improvement in humanitarian and development programs. He has 9 years of experience in improving user benefits and user experience of processes and technology in the private and nonprofit sectors in Singapore, New York, Haiti, and right now he is speaking to us from Kenya. He holds an MPA in development practice from Columbia School of International and Public Affairs, and in his spare time he enjoys playing the ukulele. So Lucian will begin his talk in a moment.
So hi everyone, thanks for joining my session. My name is Lucian Lee. I'm the Senior Advisor for Systematic Cost Analysis at the International Rescue Committee. My pronouns are he, him, his, and I'm personally based in Nairobi in Kenya. So I just wanted to, thanks Nick for that nice introduction. I wanted to maybe, before diving into what I want to talk about today, just kind of give you an idea of what I actually do in the IRC, because every time when people hear cost analysis, they think about financials like audits or compliance, and I assure you I do nothing of that. I'm not a finance person, but I have had to spend my life looking at finance data. So what I do and my team in the IRC, we do is to compare the budget data and the spending data, so finance data, with the M&A data. So we would look at how much money we're spending, and out of that money, what are we achieving? What kind of outputs are we achieving? What kind of outcomes, if possible, are we achieving? And my role also includes coordinating with other NGOs, so people like Save the Children, Mercy Corps, CARE, Action Against Hunger, and hopefully increasingly Danish Refugee Council as well, on issues related to value for money. How do we measure value for money, and how can we use this tool called DAPTRA, which I'll present to you in a few moments, to analyze the cost efficiency of our programs, not just within our countries, but hopefully compare that across the different NGOs as well, across the different non-governmental organizations as well. And so just a bit of my background, I used to work in the private sector. So I was doing marketing communications in an engineering company. And then when I left for grad school, I started working in econometrics and M&E. And I was also a counselor for people presenting in the clinic to get HIV tests, and just in general, if people have any questions on their sexual health. And so I've been with IRC for 3 years now. Right after when I was still in grad school, I was interning for IRC. And then after I graduated, I joined them initially as a consultant and then transitioned to my current full-time role 3 months later. And so, yeah, it's almost my 3-year anniversary now. So what I thought we'd talk about today is the notion of value for money and cost analysis, and how value for money links to cost analysis, and what can we learn from cost analysis. And over the course of this presentation, I'll also share a pre-recorded video of a colleague in Somalia who would be interested to join us today, but could not join us because of the time zone. And so we recorded a video where he was talking about how they use cost analysis information to make program decisions in their country. So just to start off with kind of the background, I want us to make sure that we're all on the same page, that the money out there is limited. The humanitarian needs are out there. There's a lot of need, a lot of humanitarian needs, a lot of development needs, especially with COVID these days. But the money to fund and meet those needs are limited, and more so with COVID, because governments, like major donors who typically fund humanitarian development programs in the countries where we work in, are looking more towards their own finances within their own country. And so the amount of funding that these other humanitarian needs within other countries are increasingly limited. And so it's very hard to know what kind of, what do we need to do with this pot of money, with this shrinking pot of money? What can we do? What can we prioritize in order to meet these needs and provide the most benefit to the most people that we can? And it's hard to do this kind of prioritization and say, what kind of activities do we need to implement? What kind of approaches do we need to provide? Because the information on cost efficiency of our programs is quite rare and quite limited. And even when they exist, it's quite hard to compare. And again, in a second, I'm going to talk about that. But yeah, I just wanted to frame what value for money kind of means, which is we have a limited amount of time, we have a limited amount of money, and how do we use that time and money to provide more impact for more people? So maybe not donuts, but something else. And so that something else could be interventions that we know work in certain places. So for example, you could think of cash transfer programs, or you could think of the more traditional non-food item distribution programs that traditional nonprofits do in humanitarian contexts. And we know that some interventions, they would provide more impact to more people. But which ones and under what conditions, in which context? That's the question. And so for IRC, we looked at a few programs that we implemented in the Syria region a few years ago because of the Syrian refugee crisis. And so we were trying to compare between cash transfer programs and non-food item distribution programs, NFI programs in short, and see which ones are more cost efficient in that context and that we could maybe prioritize in the future. And you could see already that, so the yellow data points are NFI programs, so non-food item distributions, which reach more than 2,000 households, whereas at that time, the cash transfer programs that we have are quite small. And so they were able to reach, let's say 500, maximum 1,000 households. And so when we tried to compare at least programs of the same size, programs with the same scale, we saw that non-food item distribution programs just cost a bit more per dollar value of the items provided than cash transfer programs. So cash transfer programs, the way to read this graph is the higher the number on the y-axis, the more expensive that program is. So the y-axis looks at the cost to transfer $1 of cash or a dollar value of non-food item to our clients. And so the lower the data points are, the more efficient they are. Whereas the higher they are, the less efficient and more costly they are. And so for this, at the same scale, we saw that non-food item distribution programs cost more than cash transfer programs. And so therefore, that means cash transfer programs are more efficient in that sense. And to put it in more concrete terms, if you have, for example, a $1 million budget provided by the donor, and they say, okay, use it to benefit the clients and the refugees in the Syria region, what are you going to do with it? So armed with this $1 million budget, if you were to put that money into cash transfers and provide about $400 per household, you will be able to serve about 1,900 households in total with this $1 million budget. But if you were to pump this money into NFI distributions, and again, assuming that you're providing about $400 equivalent value of items per household to each household, you'll only be able to serve about 1,300 households. And so that means about 600 households will get missed out. And this just gives us more incentive to more motivation to say we should prioritize cash transfer programs because it allows us to reach more households beyond the other argument that just providing cash is less paternalistic, it provides people more options, and it's just better overall for market invigoration. But just on the cost efficiency side of things, this is how we wanted to compare it. And you might And so here, I think you might be asking, like, how, maybe you are, maybe you aren't, how did we arrive at these data points? Because each one of these it represents 8 different analyses. And so I wanted to also give you an idea of what it means to do cost analysis, because it's a term that gets thrown around quite a bit. And here in this graph specifically, we looked at cost efficiency analysis, but there are many other types of cost analysis that I wanted to bring to your attention and maybe clarify a little bit what each of those mean. And the easiest way to do that is to start by looking at the M&E log frame and look at the different types of analyses that can be done with each component of the log frame. So you would start by having an activity, right, that you want to implement. So in this example that I'm giving here is after-school tutoring. So for example, it's an education program where you feel like maybe the school system is a little bit lacking, the teachers are not as well trained, and maybe you want to improve the children's literacy skills by providing some form of after-school tutoring to those kids who may want to take up this program. And you would have your inputs. So that basically just means the money that you're allowed to spend to implement this activity. And that money would go to things like your staff salaries, your travel costs, your material costs for printing and for the materials to do the tutoring, things like that. So these are all your inputs, and this is just basically your costs. Now, from those inputs, from those costs, what can you achieve with it? What are you going to do with it? And that goes down the next level to the outputs. And so we would want to look at, for example, how many children were tutored in a year from the activity that we're trying to implement. And so this is where cost efficiency analysis comes in, where we look at all the costs to do this activity and divide it by the number of outputs achieved from this activity to get at the cost per child tutored per year. And so that will be your cost efficiency result. The next level that you move down is the outcomes level, where you start to think about the impact and the benefits accrued by your clients from this activity. So, for example, if you're interested in increasing children's literacy skills, you might want to say, okay, I hope this activity, this program could have the outcome of improving people's literacy skills. And the way I want to measure it is typically for education, it's like a standard deviation increase in the child's literacy. If it's not a lot of increase, that means it's not a very effective program. If it's a large increase, then it might be a very effective program, but then you also have to interrogate under what circumstances. And so this is where cost effectiveness analysis comes in, where you take all the costs for this activity and divide it by the outcomes to get at the cost per standard deviation increase in child literacy skills. And there's also an analysis that also gets thrown around quite a bit, particularly in the development sector for like infrastructure projects or for climate resilience projects, and that is cost-benefit analysis. And the way we think about this is to say, is the program worth doing it? Are the benefits bigger than the costs, or do the costs outweigh the benefits? And so we would take the value of the monetary value of the benefits incurred from this activity and subtract that with the cost to do this activity. So if it's a positive value, you would say, okay, maybe it's worth the money because the benefits are more than the costs. So it's worth your money putting in to do this activity. But if this is a bigger number, then of course it means you have a bigger return on investment. If it's a negative number, then that means your costs outweigh your benefits and it's probably not worth doing this program. And an example for that would be the costs that you incur now to increase these children's future income because they have higher literacy and they have high literacy skills in primary and secondary school. And so therefore, when they become of working age, they could increase their future income. And the reason I put this blue box here around cost efficiency is not because we love cost efficiency so much, but it's just because it's just more practical for an implementing NGO like IRC to do compared to things like cost effectiveness analysis and cost benefit analysis. And I'll tell you why it's just more practical and easier, and just gives us more understanding of our programs. The first reason is because it's directly observable. This information, the number of children treated, the output information, is something that everyone has, and that everyone should be monitoring in our log frame, in our M&E data anyway. And so we already have this information at hand. We have the costs that we spend at hand in our finance data, in our finance reports. And so it's just directly observable. We can immediately say, how much did it cost to tutor a child last year in 2020 compared to the previous year in 2019, compared to this year in 2021. And for effectiveness and outcomes related data, we rarely have the quantitative level, we rarely have that data at the quantitative level that we can attribute to this program and say, it is because of tutoring, our tutoring program, that these children's literacy skills increased by 1 or 2 standard deviation, because there are so many things that go into the potential increase of the person's literacy skills. So for example, you could think of things like the child is not asked to work in the field, or is not asked to work at home, and so therefore they're able to concentrate more on their studies and improve their literacy. So that's one thing that is completely not related to tutoring, right? The other potential reason could be that the school began providing menstrual products or menstrual support systems, bathrooms that girls can go to, for example, and so that they would continue to attend school and not stay at home because when they had their period, because of shame or stigma in the community. And so that is also something that's completely unrelated to tutoring that could improve the children's literacy skills. And so it's just very iffy. Short of doing like an impact evaluation or like a randomized control trial, it's very hard for us to have quantitative outcome data that is attributable to the activity that we're doing. And so usually we infer the outcomes qualitatively by interviews or client stories, and they would say, oh, because of the tutoring, I was able to improve my reading and from this grade to that grade, and I now can read more books in the library than I could previously, for example. And there's also the issue of the multiple outcomes. So for example, if you're doing tutoring or any kind of education program where you maybe care about their future income that they could earn when they reach working age, or maybe there's also a possibility that because of the increase in literacy, they would also have an increase in their life expectancy. So for example, if girls have better literacy, and better education levels, the chances of them getting involved in a child marriage or getting unwanted pregnancies are just a bit lower, and therefore allows them to live a longer life, live a more fulfilling life, and increase their life expectancy at the same time. And so you might have multiple outcomes, and it's often quite hard, and you would have to make a choice to say, okay, what do I want to quantify? Do I want to quantify the cost per increase in income or the cost per disability adjusted life years that was gained because of increased education, for example? And so that's also the thing that is hard to compare between different programs, because you're using different types of metrics. The last one is that understanding cost efficiency just gives us more immediate lessons, because we have this M&A data usually on a quarterly basis, monthly or quarterly basis, but we usually do reporting in a yearly basis anyway. And so at the end of the year, it's quite easy for you to say, okay, what was the cost per child tutor in 2020? How could we improve that in 2021? And so it's pretty immediate that you can think of ways to improve the efficiency compared to things like outcomes, because again, those can be quite qualitative, theoretical, like what does it even mean to increase a standard deviation in child literacy? It's quite hard to wrap your head around. And also it takes time to materialize. So if you're talking, especially for longer term things like income and life expectancy, where it's going to be 10 years down the road or 20 years down the road, or even for life expectancy, it may increase from 50 years to 60 years, for example. It will take all that time for the benefits to accrue and for you to be able to say, okay, this program was worth it or not in the end. And so that's why we rarely look into cost effectiveness analysis, unless we're doing an impact evaluation or randomized control trial. And we almost never look into cost benefit analyses, short of livelihoods programs that maybe look at the increased earnings from the savings groups, or increased earnings from this business loan that they were able to get from the program, and therefore generate more income in the short term. So usually we'll focus on cost efficiency analysis. And yeah, and I put here the box just to highlight that this is comparative, because you're looking at after school tutoring. Maybe you have something else in mind. Maybe you want to say, instead of providing tutoring, maybe I want to improve the teachers' skills. So maybe you want to provide tutoring not to students, but to the teachers, so that they can teach better and maybe in that way improve the students' literacy skills. And so when you compare between those two different types of activities, or within the same activity, the different approaches to do that activity, then you can look into, okay, maybe one way of doing things could be more efficient or less efficient than another way of doing things. Using the kind of analogy of apples to apples comparison, if you have an apple and I say it's whatever, 50 cents per apple, is it cheap? Is it expensive? Is it efficient? Is it not? Like, it's hard to tell unless you tell me, okay, for the green apple, it's 50 cents, but for the red apple, it's $1. And so then you'll say, okay, so the red apple is a bit more expensive, but because of XYZ reasons. And so it sounds on the surface, it sounds quite straightforward, where you're taking all the costs and dividing it by the outputs to get your cost per child tutored and comparing that across programs. On the surface, it sounds quite straightforward, but why is it that we have so little data that we could meaningfully use and compare across programs? And there are a few reasons for it, but I just want to highlight 3 reasons. The first one being the data. So at IRC, we have budget data that we use to submit proposals. And then once the proposal gets approved and we start implementing, we also have this kind of quarterly or yearly reports, budget versus actuals, where we see, okay, what's our spending compared to the amount that we budgeted for. And at the back end, we also have a finance system where that records all the transactions that go into this program. And so it's a lot of data floating around. And usually when we do the analysis, we'd have to ask the finance team, can you give me the budget data? Can you give me the expense data? Can you give me the transaction level data? Oh, no, you're giving me the category level data. I need the budget line data. Oh, no, you're giving me last quarter's data. I need 2020's data. And so it's a lot of this kind of data back and forth floating around that takes up a lot of time that frankly, no one has the luxury of, especially not finance people in the country offices. And the other thing I wanted to point out is spreadsheets. And it's quite easy for me as an analyst to say, okay, for this activity, we may think of the labor cost, the staff costs, so short-term or long-term staff, or we may have meetings or training costs. What is the cost to rent the hall or to provide stipends for the participants, or to provide travel costs, for example. And so a lot of times, different consultants, different NGOs, different donors ask for different information in different spreadsheet templates. That again just takes up too much time from people's day jobs to do this kind of analysis. No one gets paid for this kind of analysis. And so it just takes up too much time. And then when you transfer spreadsheets around, it just gets either the links get broken, the formulas get broken, or it's not in the version that you have is not the latest one. And there are multiple versions floating around. And so over the years, we've come to realize that spreadsheet-based analysis is just not something that we would want to prioritize. We still do it, but in a more systematic way. And this example on the top right corner here is a real-life example provided by an evaluator working with a donor who wanted to do a cost analysis of our program, which, just frankly speaking, is not possible to do because we'd have to go through thousands, tens of thousands of transactions to get at this information that they need. And so we would need a better way to systematize the way we do analysis so that everyone is doing it at the same way, more or less the same way, and not have all these spreadsheets floating around. The other two things I wanted to mention is on the metrics. So when people report their cost efficiency information, so for example, the cost per output, cost per child, for example, in this case, what actually are they measuring in terms of the cost? Are they measuring just the program costs, or are they measuring all the costs, including the shared and indirect costs? And when they're measuring the number of children, are they measuring the number of children treated, or are they measuring the number of children recovered? So the top line question here is which one of these treatment models provide more benefit for more people? So you could think of a malnutrition treatment program. Maybe you have Model A that's implemented by, let's say, IRC, and Model B implemented by a different NGO in a different country, or maybe even in the same country. And then you look at these information that's coming out of the reports. And one of them, the report says it costs $98 per child. The other one says it costs $329 per child. On the surface, it looks like, okay, maybe Model A is cheaper and more efficient and allows us to spend our money on more children. But when you start digging deeper, you would then start to see, okay, maybe Model A was only reporting their program costs. And so these are things like staff salaries of the people who are providing treatment, and maybe even the ready-to-use therapeutic foods that they use for malnutrition treatment, and that's kind of it. But maybe in Model B, this NGO was reporting $329 per child because they included not just the program costs, but they included shared costs like the office level, rent, utilities, cleaning fees, security, even the cleaners, the finance staff, the supply chain staff, the HR staff who are not directly involved in malnutrition treatment, but they kind of help to keep the lights on and support you in doing recruitment or doing reporting. We still need those people, but they are considered shared costs, and sometimes people don't report them into their numbers. And so it's just a bit misleading when you only look at the numbers without interrogating what goes into those numbers. And the third thing I was going to mention is the metric of the outputs. So $98 per child could be $98 per child who was treated, or it could be, well, in this case, $329 per child who recovered from the program. And the difference is maybe in this treatment model, you have 5,000 children coming in to be treated. And so they were just 5,000, there was just 5,000 children enrolled in your program. And so if you take all your program costs divided by 5,000, you would get $98 per child treated. Whereas maybe in treatment model B, they were counting the number of children who recovered. So out of 5,000 children, maybe 4,000 recovered because the remaining 1,000 either dropped out of the program, they maybe some of them even passed away, the treatment wasn't working for them, or maybe some of them were still sick, were still malnourished and could not be considered recovered because maybe they have other underlying conditions, like tuberculosis, for example, that at the time of analysis, at the time of reporting, they were still sick and therefore not counted as recovered. And so if you are able to report things in the same way and say, okay, for Model A, it costs about $98 per child recovered, all costs included. And for Model B, it costs $329 per child recovered, all costs included, program shared and indirect costs. Then we can start to compare apples with apples and say, okay, maybe Model A looks to be a bit more efficient in this context, but why is it more efficient? That's when the fun part comes in. We can start to unpack the context reasons, the program reasons for it being more efficient. Maybe Model A was implemented in a community where you have a higher prevalence of malnutrition, and therefore you just have more malnourished kids to treat. So the more children you're able to treat, the lower your costs are going to be. Whereas maybe Model B was implemented in a community where there is very little malnourished children to treat in the first place, and so your cost per child is just going to be high no matter what. And so this is what we want to try to find out, and then say, okay, it really looks like Model A because they were using some kind of community-managed protocol compared to Model B, which is more expensive, it's center-based, it's waiting for children to come to you, whereas Model A is reaching out through community health volunteers to get children in to be treated before they get too sick. Is the cheaper way to go, is the more efficient way to go, and therefore we should be prioritizing Model A. And so that's the main top line lesson. We want to come out to say maybe Model A under these conditions would provide more benefit to more people, in this case malnourished children. And so you saw all those challenges, right, of doing cost analysis, and I also want to highlight the solutions to meeting those challenges. So now that we know why is it so difficult, how can we generate comparable data more easily and faster, so that we can have this data more readily available? And in the past, we've focused on HQ, headquarter level analysts like myself, doing these analyses on spreadsheets and asking people, okay, what are your programs? What are you doing? And then churning out analyses once every 3 days, I want to say. Well, spending about 3 days per analysis to get it done. Whereas now, if we want to kind of democratize the way to do analysis, we could have program staff who are managing their own programs and know so much better about their programs to do cost analysis themselves using existing data that they already have in the finance system, so that they don't have to, again, look at spreadsheets and go back and forth between, okay, are we thinking about cost per child recovered? Are we thinking about cost per child treated? So none of that will be a consideration because in future, because of this tool that we're using right now called Dioptra. So Dioptra is this online browser-based tool, web-based tool that was developed by IRC, Mercy Corps and SAFE starting in 2018, 2019. So that our program staff can a bit more quickly and consistently calculate the cost efficiency using existing backend finance data that we already have. And so increasingly we have other NGOs like Action Against Hunger, CARE, Daily News Refugee Council involved, and also hopefully CRS, Catholic Relief Services as well. And we know that cost analysis is not rocket science. Like you saw the basic formula. It's basically just cost divided by outputs. And there are a series of pretty fixed, consistent steps that you can take to do the analysis that is automated by the tool, and it just guides you through the different steps to say, okay, in this step, this is what we want you to do. In the next step, once you're done, this is what we want you to do. And so to arrive at the cost efficiency results in usually 3 hours or less. And so it just allows people to do this more quickly and allows more people to do this because all our country program staff are able to access Dioptra. And enough about me talking about the virtues of cost analysis or the virtues of Dioptra. I wanted to share a video clip of my colleague, Muhammad Hussein Nasib, who is the Economic Recovery and Development Coordinator in IRC in Somalia, who was implementing some cash transfer programs, I think back in 2018 or 2019, I think. You'll see, and how they use the results of those analysis to learn some lessons about the work that they're doing and potentially ways that they could improve. So let me play the video.
This is Muhammad Hussein Nasib, ERD coordinator Economic Recovery and Development Coordinator for the IRC Somalia program. So I just wanted to share a bit of experience on the use of the diaspora tool to analyze the cost efficiency for some of the cash transfer programs for Somalia. So we have provided some cash transfer programs in Somalia from 2019 to 2020 is what actually constituted our analysis. So we have looked into around 900,000 cash we have given to beneficiaries affected by food insecurity as a result of drought, floods, and locust infestation in regions such as Nugal, Mudug, Galgaduud, and Hiran regions. From the analysis that we've done, we came up with some key takeaways, some lessons that we've learned from it. So the first one was that we realized that long-term funding could be, more cost efficient than the short-term funding. And why we're saying that is from the analysis we've done, we've realized that long-term funding was a bit cheaper compared to the short-term funding, and that we've seen we could save by half what we will spend in the short-term funding. So from the diagram that you see, we've spent around 37 cents to transfer $1 to the beneficiary, while for the short-term funding we have transferred 67 cents to transfer $1. So from the cost savings that you can see, we have around 30 cents. So when that adds up, we are able to reach more beneficiaries. And why is that so? It is so because with the long-term funding, we are in a consortium called the Building Resilient Communities in Somalia, funded by different donors. But the funding analysis we're looking is a project by FCDO, former DFID. So with the long-term funding, what happened was that it helped us, trust building among the partners. And so we had, existing financial relationship with the donor to be able to carry out interventions much faster. And we were able to reach, beneficiaries at a larger scale in a more timely manner than anything. So what reducing the cost is because we already know the communities, we already know who is most, affected by the crisis. And we have already long-term negotiations and engagements with the communities and local authorities. We will not spend much time on costs such as, acceptance of local officials to select locations to reach beneficiaries. So we already know the communities, we know who is most suffering. We're able to get the most vulnerable households, and we're able to reach them much faster. So we will not need to develop a new proposal that takes time. So the advantage with this was we have the money. There is flexibility to change internal funds available to reach more beneficiaries at a time when they need it most. So the second learning from it was that we realized that the total amount transferred was a major factor, for cost efficiency. And why we're saying is that, once you are transferring, cash to the beneficiaries, we normally look at the minimum expenditure basket. So which is fixed, based on the donor, approval, as well as recommendations by the, if you're transferring cash, we normally have the cash working group in Somalia that provides guidance and recommendations when it comes to the transfer of cash. So, and it's also based on the minimum expenditure basket. So for this matter, since that the minimum expenditure basket or the amount we're transferring is fixed, so the amount you transfer to the beneficiary or the number of households that you reach will significantly, be a major factor when you are looking at the cost efficiency. So with a long-term, funding, we had some flexibilities, which actually enabled, our scale and reach transfer to the beneficiaries. So what you will find is the more you send to the beneficiaries, the more transfers that are made to the beneficiaries, the more you cost efficient. The lesser you transfer to the beneficiaries, where the bulk of the costs are absorbed through reaching out to the beneficiaries, then your cost of efficiency will really go down. So from the learning is that we will require to, in as much as possible, reduce all support admin-related costs where possible, to ensure that more is allocated to the beneficiary. Then we're enhancing, our cost efficiency. So the next learning was that we have seen the transfer costs were driven by preparations for distribution. From if you see maybe the slide, you will see that the preparation for distribution is about 36%, where the external coordination meetings we've seen around 8%, pre-distribution around 4%. So we have grant management, 18%, distributions 11%. So why is the preparations for distribution are higher? Because the process for you to actually, before you distribute anything, you will require to register beneficiaries. You require to get acceptance from the local authorities. You will need to mobilize beneficiaries. You need procurements for the materials to be used for benefit for registration. You buying maybe if you are in our case it is mobile phone. The delivery mechanism to transfer cash to beneficiaries is through mobile, and so for beneficiaries who do not have a phone, you have to purchase a phone and a SIM card. So the preparations for distribution is huge, because you have to undergo all that processes. And for Somalia especially, the road network coverage is really bad, and you want to reach beneficiaries in remote locations where you're required to travel sometimes over 200 kilometers. And therefore, because of that, the cost of vehicle rental and the like is also very, very expensive. And that's why preparing for distribution is very expensive. If you see the distributions are limited, because through the mobile, we're not incurring a lot of costs, because cash is sent to the beneficiary mobile phone. So what we're learning from this is, in as much as we can reduce the preparation for distribution, then we're really making opening the way to make savings, which can be used to reach more beneficiaries. So how we can do that is, for instance, if we have stayed in a given location for quite some time, especially for the multi-year projects, where we have developed, as I told you, good relationships with community members. We have developed, acceptance with communities, and we have stayed with them, solidifying some level of trust. For that matter, we already know the communities, and we are able to do some, pre-registration of the most vulnerable as a preparation. When a crisis comes, we know who is most vulnerable. So working with local authorities, we can create some lists before a drought comes or a flood comes, and then when it hits, we are able to make registrations, avoiding some of the processes where we would have been required to go through. For instance, because you have long-term engagement, the project has been going on, you will not need to seek local authority acceptance. You do not need much community mobilization. You already know the most vulnerable, and therefore if you have those lists initially in place, then you're able to reduce all costs associated with preparations for distribution. So those are some of the things we are thinking of moving forward. So the next learning is about the number of project field locations may affect the cost efficiency. And why we're saying that is, every field office, will really require some kind of fixed costs, and therefore that office will require, a admin and support costs. It requires program staffing costs. So if the number of field locations are many, and the amount of funds you have is limited, and you try to spread yourselves too thin to ensure at least each field office is covered, then much of the funds might be absorbed by support costs, and therefore the amount that is reaching out to the beneficiaries will be very much limited, which therefore means we will not be in a position to reach more people. And therefore what we're saying, what we're learning from that is it is sometimes good that we intensify project activities in one or few locations where we can create more impact, rather than spreading ourselves too thin in multiple locations. For instance, we want to reach maybe 300 people with multi-purpose cash transfers for them to meet their basic needs. So if that is divided into 3 regions, where, for instance, the IRC has offices, you will find that we're going to reach maybe 100 in each location. And imagine maybe in each location, the needs are high. And therefore the 100 is not felt by even the community members. But imagine if that is directed to one field office, you will reach like 300 households. There is some element of impact sense within such communities. So what we're saying is not only from the impact side, but also on the cost efficiency side. With more offices, you're likely to incur more fixed costs. With more support costs, more program staffing costs, which really reduces the amount that is out for beneficiaries, lesser beneficiaries, lesser impact field. So generally, from the cost efficiency analysis that we've done, what we're really now doing is we're trying to shape our interventions, ensuring that based on the lessons we've learned from the analysis using the dioptera that we've done, we're trying to shape our interventions in a manner that one will reduce pre-distribution costs. How are we doing that? If we have long-term projects, we are liaising with communities to ensure they identify most vulnerable households, so that when crisis comes in, we are able to, without moving up or down, going to locations, we're able to get the lists and do one verification to see if these vulnerable households are still there, and then we prepare the process for the distribution of cash to beneficiaries. That's one way we're trying to use the analysis we have done to shape, our future interventions. Number two, we are trying at least to consolidate our efforts through rigorous needs analysis to ensure that we focus our attention into the most vulnerable locations where we think we can make impact by analyzing what other partners are working in those locations and actually fill in areas where we think there is coverage gap to ensure we have our interventions have more impact. So that's how we're using the analysis that we've done, and thank you so much.
All right, so that was Nasib from IRC in Somalia, and I want to make sure we have enough time for questions. So just one, before I close out, I just want us to come back to the reason why we're doing cost analysis in the first place, because organizations like IRC, we receive funds, donor funding to implement the programs that we want to implement, that based on people's needs. And so we are the stewards of these funds, limited though they may be. It's still money that is in our hands that we could use for the benefit of the people that we're serving. So we, as the stewards of these funds, we have a responsibility to make the most positive change in the lives of the most people in need based on with this money that we have. And so this information that we can get from cost analysis would just allow us to make better, more informed decisions on which kind of activities that we should that we should prioritize, and maybe how we would want to implement it. As Nasib said, maybe we want to focus more on just one field office and focus on serving more households within that community, that location. But of course, not forgetting other things like effectiveness, impact, as Nasib was saying, equity, client needs, people, what do people actually want, and also program quality. So with that, let's open up for questions. And I think I'll pass it back to Nick to facilitate.
That's right. So yeah, we do have time for a few questions. We can't keep Lucian too long because it's quite late in Nairobi right now. But thank you for staying around a little longer. So if you have a question you'd like to ask, you can type it into the chat and I will ask it to Lucian on your behalf. Or I think we're small enough head count that if people would like to unmute themselves and ask a question directly, just put your hand up using the reactions button, and I will call on you when it's your turn. So while the audience has a chance to think about any questions they'd like to ask, I have one of my own. So we've seen a lot from your presentation and Mohammed's about how you use Dioptra to identify operational cost efficiencies within your existing programs. But we see a lot of these types of analyses also coming out in fundraising solicitations or proposals to grant-making foundations where it's become very common to say that you can, for some tiny amount of money, you can avert this terrible disease or enact some really positive outcome by getting through some efficient organization. Does IRC use these, or your partner organizations use these tools to generate those types of statistics as well that are outward facing, or is it largely an internal use tool?
So the way we're using Dioptra right now is at the level of the program. So things that you were mentioning earlier, comparing different organizations in terms of how much they're spending on programs versus operations, that's a pretty kind of high level aggregated information just for people to say, okay, maybe MSF is spending less on operations compared to IRC, and therefore they are just on the whole operationally a bit more efficient. That's what you would see at the top level at most NGOs' websites. But what we're talking about here with Dioptra, which is not done by the Dioptra, because that's just basically taking all their accounting data and just separating it by program versus support, and then just reporting that percentage. For Dioptra, we will look at the program activity itself. So for example, if it's a malnutrition treatment program, we might say something like it costs about $100 per child treated, which is a number that often gets thrown out by IRC, much to our chagrin in our unit, in our team, because it depends so much on the context and the countries and the locations and the prevalence of malnutrition in these different areas. And so it's very hard to kind of hold a project to that level of standard without adding in those caveats to say, okay, you can achieve potentially $100 per child treated if you have this level of prevalence of malnutrition or this level of population density in your area, which is not often gets talked about enough. And so what Dioptra is doing is feeding into that that bigger nuance of how much does it cost to treat a child, in what context, under what conditions, for which type of programming. And so that's what we're using Dioptra for, which, yeah, other NGOs are hopefully more and more getting involved. But as just another example is in Mali, where IRC has malnutrition treatment programming. We're looking at two different types of protocols, and we're saying maybe protocol B is a bit more efficient. And so at the same location where you can just ignore out of all of those confounding variables, we were then able to see, okay, maybe treatment model B is potentially more efficient based on Dioptra's results, but then also kind of digging into maybe it's because of the supply chain, maybe it's because you are able to reach more children in this method. And so that's mostly what Dioptra is looking at. And then when we have this information, we want to share it out to other NGOs, other partners, to say, this is what we're learning. Maybe you guys think of something different, or you guys can also do more analyses and we can compare and combine our results.
Sure. Yeah, that seemed to be the direction that this tool was taking you in, but that very lack of nuance that you don't like, I think, is a feature, not a bug, for certain, the way that these statistics get used in other contexts. So, all the better for you that you are paying attention to where these are actually coming from. So from the chat, we have a question asking how this tool works as a collaboration between NGOs. So how does this work as a collaborative tool, both within the Dioptra partners and for building collaborative relationships with government and businesses as well?
So I'll speak to the first two because businesses are not that involved at the moment. In terms of collaboration among NGOs, it was a long process, I'm not gonna lie. It was quite a number of years of gaining trust among people, that we're not trying to race each other to the bottom and trying to get donor funding by proving ourselves as the cheapest, but just getting people to trust what we're trying to do here and get people on the same page that this type of cost analysis at the end of the day is just better for everyone, for us, but also for the clients that we're serving. And so we needed some funding from donors to fund, for example, my time, full-time, to work with other NGOs who are also, some of them are funded full-time, to work on Dioptra and work on shared understanding of cost analysis to begin with, because no NGO has like a cost analysis department besides IRC right now. And so it was many years of engagement, trust building, and having that kind of consortium platform that NGOs can work on and share data. In terms of governments, this one is more towards donors and not so much towards the government of the countries where we're working in, because right now we're still at a level of making sure donor governments understand what the costs mean. So when you say cost per child treated is $98 per child treated or recovered, that's basically the education that we're trying to push to donors to be able to interpret cost results in much more nuance. And so if there's one thing that I want you guys to take away from today's presentation is that look at cost results in a more nuanced way and interpret them according to all those contextual reasons and programmatic reasons before you start saying, one thing is cheaper than the other.
Talia, would you like to unmute yourself and ask your question?
Yeah, you actually kind of answered it with that last question. I was just going back more into like the benefits of showing like the lower programming costs versus the higher programming cost to donors and how they receive that and whether or not like that transparency is there. But you kind of just nailed it with the last question too.
Yeah, and just to close out that point as well, in terms of the collaboration, because it was this kind of trusted environment within the NGOs, and with many people's different voices coming in, so it's not just IRC saying something, it's also Save the Children saying it, Mercy Corps is also saying it. So we have this kind of community, this consortium of people who are doing cost analysis and telling the donor, hey, look, it may cost a bit cheaper or a bit more expensive in this context because of these different ways to interpret it. And we have to be on the same page in terms of the way we do the measurement of, and to measure the cost per child treated, for example. And so the more NGOs talk about it within our community, the more donors will pay attention to it and not judge us unfairly based on you're cheaper or you're more expensive.
Thank you. I am kind of curious, like, is there any effort to standardize reporting for the impact of some of these things so that there is, I mean, across NGOs, because it, you know, even just like on an accounting level, all firms have to abide by GAAP in the US. It seems a little bit kind of crazy, though not impossible, obviously, that there isn't a standardized formatting for that.
So on the reporting side, I think there are two things here. One is the way we report our cost efficiency. So for example, again, going back to malnutrition, we have this, besides this consortium that we're working in, we also work in with different kind of communities of practice where they would say, okay, we are all doing malnutrition treatment, NGOs XYZ, and increasingly we feel that it's more meaningful to look at cost per child recovered. And so that's what, across the board, we're all just going to report to the donor. And so that has been happening through these kind of communities of practice where we will standardize the way we report our cost efficiency to donors. Now, in terms of the other aspect that I think you were alluding to, which is the way we report finances in our accounting system, that is a very big undertaking, and no NGO is going to standardize the way they report into their backend finance system. So, for example, I think a couple of years ago, IRC was considering, if you're looking into analyzing activities, why don't you also spend and record your cost at the activity level? Why don't we report our costs at the activity level? And so we started listing all the various activities that we could ostensibly be doing in IRC. Treatment of malnutrition, latrine building, hygiene, promotion, water trucking, yada, yada. When the list came out to be about 38, no, I think it was about 80 something activities, we just gave up, and there's just no way we're gonna code our finances and report it in that at the activity level. And so every NGO right now is undergoing improvements, I would say, to their finance system, including IRC. We're overhauling our finance reporting system, as is most other NGOs that I know of. And it's a very huge undertaking. No NGO is going to sync up with another NGO to say, hey, let's kind of align our reporting, our finance systems with each other, because just getting our house in order is already a huge undertaking.
Can I ask why though? I mean, I do understand that it is a big undertaking, and you know, as you pointed out, like having 80 activities that you're tracking is a lot for sure. But the IRC is a huge organization, and it's just a little bit confusing for me coming from more of a business background. That's a very standard practice for organizations. So I'm just trying to kind of grasp, like, what is the driver behind it's, you know, it's feasible for lots of businesses, but it's not feasible for the nonprofit space.
Yeah, and for people like Marie Stokes, who do mostly family planning activities, that's pretty straightforward because they do outreach, they have community demand generation, they also operate their own family planning clinics. And so for NGOs that do very specific things like Marie Stokes or Action Against Hunger, who does malnutrition treatment or just nutrition programming in general, it's just a bit easier to do that kind of activity level programming. You can think of businesses as having discrete business units where they have products. Well, they might have a gazillion products, but they would have very discrete business units, like maybe 8 or 10 business units, and then you would report your finances according to those business units, sales and revenue. But for NGOs like IRC, where we're looking at water sanitation, we're looking at nutrition, we're looking at protection, we're looking at cash transfers, we're looking at livelihoods. It's just way too much and not specialized enough for us to be able to do that kind of activity level reporting compared to, let's say, the power and automation company that I used to work with, where there are 5 major units and, let's say, 5 additional business units within each unit, and then you will report by the business unit. And so it's not reporting by activity level in the same way that NGOs are reporting in terms of cost per doing cash transfers, for example.
Lucian, do you have any final comments before we give you a round of applause?
No, just thanks for having me, and yeah, thanks for giving me this chance to talk about cost analysis. We always like talking about cost analysis. We rarely find the audience to do that. So just, yeah, thanks for giving us this space to share with you what we're doing and the innovations that we have.
The pleasure was ours. Thank you for joining us.